Welcome back to the channel. I'm Patrick from Road Less Traveled. Most full suspension mountain bikes have air shocks in the rear. This has a coil spring shock. Why is it, if they're better, do most manufacturers use air shocks? And are they better? We'll get into that. If you're new to this channel, it's all about mountain biking and related topics. So please subscribe if that's something that interests you. So let's get into coil shocks. This is my YT and it came stock with a coil spring. It's the all-in suspension front and rear, and this is the all-in M2 coil rear shock. Most manufacturers use air shocks, and it's for a good reason. And that reason is adjustability. When you go to buy a mountain bike, usually you're buying it for the size. The suspension can be set up for anybody as long as they fit the bike. So if they're really lightweight or if they're real heavyweight, the suspension can be adjusted. That's because most suspensions are air suspension. The first thing you need to do to set up your suspension, whether it's the front and rear, most of the time it's the rear that this is something you worry about, is setting the sag. So the sag is the amount of compression that the shock goes through when you sit on the bike in your riding position. And that's so that the shock can work in both directions when you're riding down the trail in a neutral kind of situation. With an air shock, to adjust that sag, you just add or subtract air. So when you go to buy a bike, you go to your bike shop and you buy the bike, they set it up for you, or maybe you set it up for yourself, just taking a pump, usually included with the bike, and pump that air up just to the point where it gives you the amount of sag that you need for your weight. From there on out, it's adjusting the damping settings. Well, with the spring, there's very little adjustment you can make. This spring has an adjuster right here, and it's a ring, and it will adjust, but it's a very narrow range of weights for the rider. So if you don't happen to be the weight that they selected the spring for, you're generally going to have to change that spring on your own. Now that process isn't that difficult. I'm going to do a video very soon that shows changing the spring out and adjusting the sag for this bike. It's pretty quick, but it is more work than just pumping it up or letting air out. So why is adjustability so important? Well, as I mentioned, the manufacturer doesn't know what your weight is, so getting it set up for you right away is a big deal, and they don't want to have to change out parts. And maybe you don't want to either. But it's also very convenient if you happen to be changing weights for yourself. Maybe your weight changes throughout your time of owning the bike, or maybe you're going to put a lot of gear on that day because you're taking a long trip. In those cases with an air shock, you can just change the air pressure, but not as easy with a coil shock. Also, if you have a friend that wants to ride the bike, maybe you have another bike that you want to let them ride, or you want to have them ride this bike, it's going to be really hard to set it up for their weight if they're a much different weight than you are. Okay, so then with those advantages, why would you choose a coil shock? Well, I've got a coil on this bike, and I've got an air shock on my Canyon Spectral On. It's actually an upgraded shock that I put on that bike. It's a Cane Creek Kitsuma, very nice shock, and I really like it. When I got this bike, I was used to using that air shock. The first thing I noticed with this shock, with the coil, is something I'll call hysteresis. Now what that means is, hysteresis is really that resistance to movement that initially happens as things go from one direction to another direction. So with an air shock, you have air passages in that shock, and the air is moving back and forth as the shock is compressing and decompressing. That is the spring for that shock. With a coil shock, the spring is metal. With an air shock, the air spring, there's a little resistance to that air as it's moving back and forth through those passages. And you can feel it. Maybe I'm a little more sensitive to it than others, but I can feel it. And when I started riding this bike with this coil shock, it just started to feel a little more smooth through some of the rolly sections and a little quicker to react on some of the jarring hits. When things got really rowdy and you're just slamming through a bunch of rocks and everything's moving around, I think the bike and the shocks really rely a lot more on the compression and rebound damping. But in those situations where you've got rolly bumps, maybe off of a jump, maybe springing off of a jump, going through a corner, or that first hit, I like the spring action more. So if I like the spring action more, there's probably other people that like the spring action more. Why don't bicycle manufacturers just offer you the option? You could get a coil or you could get an air. There's another reason why an air shock and a coil shock are different. Coil shocks, this coil spring is very linear. So every unit of compression that it goes through takes the same amount of force. That first part, the second part, the last part, all require the same amount of force to move at the same amount of distance. With an air spring within an air shock, that's different. The smaller that air chamber gets as that air spring is compressing, the harder it is to move the same distance. So that's called progressivity. You do want progression in your suspension on your mountain bike. However, you can do that two ways. You can do it with the shock, and you can do it with the linkage. So that linkage can be designed, and the engineers do this in a way that the bike naturally is progressive, even with a coil spring. Now, if you were to design the bike for a coil spring and put the progression the way you like it in that linkage, and then you put an air shock on it or air spring on it, it's going to act much different, and you're not going to get the action that the engineers were intending. So going from one type of spring, for instance a coil, to an air spring on the same bike isn't always easy. Some bikes will be designed with an adjustment to the geometry that changes the progression for each type of shock, but most bikes don't. There's another thing I like about the coil spring, and that is a little bit of peace of mind. And with an air spring, you pump it up to your desired pressure, you ride it around, maybe you're riding for a few months. Air is generally going to start to leak out over time, and so you need to check it every so often. Depending on the quality of the shock, you may want to check it quite often. With the coil spring, you've just got this adjustment, mechanical adjustment, and there's nothing really forcing that to move or twist. So it's generally going to stay in that exact same setting as long as you own the bike, without any kind of leakage or creep. That gives me a little peace of mind. I know I can just set it and forget it. So which is better, a coil spring or an air spring? Well, you're going to have to decide. I like the action of the coil spring. I think if it was my choice between the two, I would go with the coil spring. But I do have a bike with an air spring, and if I want somebody to come ride with me and they're a different weight than I am, I can always adjust that one very easily. So that's the bike I'll use for that kind of adjustment. Otherwise, my preference is the coil spring. Yours may be different. So that's my review. I hope you enjoyed it. Please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. It really will help keep these videos coming. And stay tuned for my video on how to make adjustments to a coil shock. Oh shit! Oh. I